Thanks again to Professor Marcus. That was absolutely fascinating. I think probably opened up a lot of people's eyes to what is an incredibly nuanced and interesting way of seeing the debate, I think. So again, I'll just reintroduce what the topic of the discussion is. It's perception is reality. How do we form our perceptions of refugees and asylum seekers? We're joined by Professor Marcus, who you just heard speaking. To his right is Christine Rao, who's worked as a print journalist for 30 years in Sydney and Melbourne. She's author of Dealing with the Media, a handbook for media newcomers, and it was written in 2010 after she found herself on the other side of the media fence when her sister Cornelia was wrongfully held in the Baxter Detention Centre. She's written about asylum seekers since 2005 for various outlets. We're also joined by Superintendent Mark Wright. Superintendent Wright is currently the Commander of Management and Leadership Development for the New South Wales Police Force. He's a White Ribbon Ambassador and was the local area commander at Blackdown between 2008 and 2013. In 2010, he was awarded a Refugee Council Humanitarian Award, and in 2012 was named a Paul Harris Fellow by Rotary International. So I'll just start off by asking a couple of questions, and then we'll sort of throw it open to you guys, because I'm sure you've got lots and lots of different ways that you want to take it. I suppose my first question really is to Professor Marcus, and just after seeing some of the statistics that you put forward, I wonder whether there's anything that you've been able to discern in public attitudes to refugees and asylum seekers that you think is sort of particularly unique to Australia.
At one level, I don't think it is particularly different or particularly unique. But if you want to basically understand the Australian state and the way that it has functioned, what makes Australia different is that in Australia, immigration has always been tightly controlled by the government. When I say always, we're going back to like 1820s, 1830. Why? Because what made Australia different was that Australia was too far away from Europe. So governments had to be involved in bringing people to Australia through assisted passage programs for most of Australia's history, not during the gold rushes, when there was, the economic imperative, but other times people would go to North America. The end of the road. So Australian government's always been very much involved in regulating immigration. And then, of course, Australia had the White Australia policy. It wasn't unique, but it was unusual in that it was maintained for so long. Most other countries abandoned their racial discrimination policies, Western countries, after the Second World War. Australia didn't really change it till the 1970s, so very late. And even then at the present time, because of Australia's geography, Australia has been in a position of being able to control cross-border movements more effectively than, again, most any other country. And so I think Australians have become that's a very significant distinctive characteristic about Australians, that border control is just so important in this country, much more so like in America, where you complain but you live with it, where there's like 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, and in Australia there's like 50 or 60,000, and most of those are on their way out. So it's that complexity in understanding that extra element which makes Australia unique. But when, for example, I showed you that there's almost no demographic where people are very charitably disposed towards people who come by boat. That's pretty typical, as far as I understand it, across the Western world.
But I mean, what you described at the end of your talk was this horrendous calculus. That was the phrase that you used.
Yes.
And I suspect you was particularly talking about offshore detention and turning boats back and that sort of stuff.
Yes.
I mean, do you think that horrendous calculus that you're talking about is in any way linked to the sort of history that, and the unique position that Australia occupies in this sort of history of migration you've just spoken about?
It's also the capacity to be able to do something that most countries can't do. Like, say, in the United States, we're going to, put a wall along the Mexican border and make it happen. They can't. And they can do it to some extent, but they can't. In effect, what this government has done is actually moved, those controls to their ultimate.
Well, that excised Australia from itself.
Well, I mean, that's nothing new. That was Howard. So that's nothing new. What is new is this quite overt policy of turning back votes. It again happened in 2001. When in 2001 they sent back a number of votes, but that was really just talked about in the background. Now you've got sort of bright orange, light votes and so on.
Well, it's been a cyclical escalation. Sorry, it seems to have been, this has been going in cycles since Tampa, hasn't it really? And
No.
well, many years before Tampa, but Tampa really got into political focus because the World Trade Center, when you talk about context, the World Trade Center tragedy occurred in 2001, just before Howard's election after the Tampa, and that escalated fear across the globe. And Tampa appeared on the horizon just during that time, don't you think?
No. Because if you actually look at the numbers, it's numbers driven, it's not any more than that. Like, there's a very sharp spike in arrivals in 99, 2000, 2001.
Yep.
Now, the World Trade Center, that sort of gave further fuel to that. But whenever the numbers have spiked up, governments have reacted in Australia. And I think, the advocates group used to argue that it was stupid locking people up because, one, it cost too much. If you let people in the community, it would cost you 5% or 10%, was one argument. And the second argument was that it was ineffective because it was the pushback, because they're both wrong. Because people, let me just finish, people are not being locked up to save money. They're being locked up as a deterrent. It's not to save money. Government will know the numbers.
Collateral damage.
So, and the other thing, though, is to understand that, the numbers have gone from 0 to 25,000 in the space of it's a very short period of time, like 4 or 5 years. So it's a government policy which determines arrivals.
So, Chris, can I just butt in there and ask you? I mean, it seems to me that you've got a few issues with Professor Marcus's thesis there. Do you think that we're living in particularly extraordinary or different times than we were, say, 10 years ago in Australia, in terms of where debate's at and public presentation, particularly in the media, I suppose?
I feel that the debate has deteriorated. I feel the debate has deteriorated, and I think partly it's because of very complex factors. I think you're right in the sense that we can't just say this is all the media's fault, this is all the politicians' fault. There's a whole complex array of factors that are feeding into this. However, we have now become so much more fragmented. Another point that you were referring to, the fragmentation of media audiences, where, for example, a Guardian reader is not going to read the Daily Telly, and is not going to read the Blacktown Sun, and everyone is now starting to preach to the converted in the commercial media to put during a time of upheaval to increase whatever sales they may have left. And so we get this narrow casting of ideas and a ghettoisation, if you like, of ideas. And it's very difficult to find a broad understanding and a broad overview of some of these complex issues because it becomes too hard, and editors and broadcasters think that there is no audience for a nuanced debate.
What do you think? Look, at the local level, I think the local media have a significant role to play, and I certainly experienced that at Blacktown. The local media are more in tune with the local community. They're less likely to engage in debate on national policy, and I found them always to be continually supportive of what we try to achieve with the local community. And in fact, that they overtly went out of their way to help publicise many of the good stories we had at Blacktown, but we didn't receive that same level of support from the national media.
But isn't Blacktown one of the so-called redneck seats where refugee issues, if you want to believe the politicians, where the politicians stand a lot to gain by increasing fear in the western suburbs of Sydney? How did you find that? Did that correspond with your experience in Blacktown? Did you find that fear, or is it a complete artifice?
No. When I left Blacktown, I was very comfortable and confident with the reputation, the relationship that we had throughout the entire community, and the way that we were perceived and reported in the media. Now that was through a process of being able to engage with the community, highlight the positive aspects. It didn't matter where they came from or how they got here. It was about building a community. And community is like any relationship, you have to work on it. You don't just get married and let it go by, you have to build and work on that relationship. So my job as a local area commander was to try to establish a positive relationship and also help those communities, over 180 different cultural groups, to be perceived in a more positive light.
Yeah. And how did you do that?
That's probably a full session in itself, but effectively it was by utilising, through my young police officers, engaging with the different diverse communities, and a lot of it was the strength of their own leadership. And if I use the example of the Black African community, who were the emerging community when I first arrived, by utilising their leaders, and they had a strong leadership within their own community, which makes it easier for me to be able to engage with a leader that can represent the entire community, or as best we can possibly achieve. By then engaging them with the young police officers, they would walk the streets of the night together, so it wouldn't be seen as a group of black men up in the park. They would get to know them. And it was through the support of the local shopping centres, local Rotarians, local media, that we embarked on a process, I suppose, of educating them as to what is acceptable behaviour in this community, so they didn't seem to be standing out, or they weren't negatively perceived. And the very quick example I always give is that there was a group of young African boys that would sit in the steps of West Point Shopping Centre, and we were continually getting complaints about them blocking the pathways. And the police would go and move minor when legislatively were allowed to. So they're exercising their lawful power, but it's confrontational. So they perceived it as being targeted. When I had the community leaders come with me and we walked through the shopping centre, we sat and watched this group of boys at the steps. And a young lady with her two children carrying some bags came to the top of the steps and couldn't get past. She turned in disgust and walked away. And I pointed out to them at that stage, that individual has probably just formed an opinion. And it's not a true opinion, but it was her opinion. We had been trying to move these boys on for months and months. Those community leaders went and engaged with those young boys, explained to them, and we never had that problem again. So simple symbols that were very effective.
If I could just ask a question now, which sort of relates to a recent piece of policy that the coalition have brought in, which is this code of conduct that asylum seekers who are released out into the community are now sort of made to sign, which essentially tells them to sign on to the Australian way of life and Australian values, or face basically being put back into detention if they're caught doing anything that's deemed untoward. I mean, in your experience, Mark, is policy like that particularly positive or beneficial to the communities that you're working with?
There certainly has to be some broad guidelines. I think there needs to be an acceptance and understanding that there are rules. It was interesting, most of the issues we had with different cultural groups were the next generation, and I describe them as the westernised youth, because the parents had lost that control over their children, because they had started to be influenced by the young Anglo-Saxon males that would say, you don't have to listen to your parents, we don't do it here like that. And then some of the cultural groups felt confused, I suppose, because we were always talking to them about domestic violence and you can't strike your children. So they were getting mixed messages as how do I discipline my children? When we first arrived, everything was good because they complied. Now they've gone to school and they're starting to learn the Australian way. So it was real mixed messages for them, and I felt very sorry for them. And I remember talking to a group of African women one night, and she explained to me that when she first sent her children to school, that she was approached by a community group, a community services group, because she had failed to collect a child from school, as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old child. In her mind, the 7-year-old was picking up the 5-year-old, and she said, because at home, the 8-year-old looks after the 7-year-old, looks after the 6-year-old, looks after the 5-year-old. So it was mixed messages. So I think there needs to be some policy and some broad guidelines and understanding, but I think the best impact is at the local level. because each community has its own discrete differences, I suppose.
Okay. I think at this point we'll open up to a couple of questions, and I might ask a few more questions towards the end. So has anybody got anything that they want to ask? No? Okay. Oh, there we go. At the front.
Professor, I found your talk very interesting, and it's raised so many questions in my mind. I'm not sure where you're actually going to start. But let's take with one perception that a lot of this reaction, negative reaction, is Australians being negative towards Muslims, for example. I'd put it to you that if the numbers coming by boat were Christians, the result really wouldn't be any different. We would not accept them as boat people, no matter what background they're from, unless they're English. Yes, I agree with you, and I believe it is about numbers and control rather than the culture.
Yeah.
That might be an additional element, but it's that historical thing of needing to control your borders, unrealistic in many countries, but not so in Australia. And controlling the numbers is really important. Would you agree with that?
Yep, certainly. Because bear in mind, again, people don't really know who's coming on the boats. So it's again, their values are informing how they perceive that. But one of the interesting things about Australia, I'd say, in the last maybe decade, is even when there have been debates about immigration, it's been about numbers. It has not been about race. So I would agree with you that if they were white, Rhodesians or whatever, it might take a longer while, but I think after a while there would again be a very strong impulse to actually control that process.
But if I could just pull you up a little bit on that, I mean, and forgive me if I've got the statistics wrong on this, but the 2013 report does break down by ethnicity, people's attitudes towards certain migration, and it does show that migration from the Middle East is generally regarded as sort of less favourable. Is that not correct?
It is.
And what do you attribute that to? And is that method of arrival? Is that sort of
that's
institutionalised prejudice? Or?
That's not attitudes to. It's not attitudes to asylum seekers. It's general attitudes to immigrants. And there's a hierarchy. There's always been a hierarchy. In every country, there is a hierarchy. Like you tell me one country in the world, whether it's been China or Afghanistan or Iran or Belgium, where there isn't a hierarchy of preferred immigrants. It's just how it works.
But I mean,
but the striking thing about Australia is that even when we ask people about attitudes to, say, Muslim immigrants, you don't get a clear majority of people saying no, bad, stop it. Certainly over the telephone, only about 25% of people will say we don't agree with that. It's high if you ask them in different contexts, but it's still not a majority.
But I mean, if we're talking, and Chris, perhaps you could talk to this about the way in which the media represents the issue of boat migration. It is often seen as, well, I suppose depending on which media you're reading, and I'm particularly talking about some of the Murdoch tabloids and perhaps even the Australian. It's spoken about as a Muslim issue, really, isn't it? I mean, there's a particular case study that I remember. It was one of the first stories that I worked on, which was a guy called Syed Abdul Latif, who was detained in Villawood Detention Centre and had an Interpol red notice on his name. And there was a huge outcry that he was going to be, a huge terror threat. And I remember reading a column by Greg Sheridan at the time that essentially equated the issue of boat migration to a national security and terrorist threat. And I wonder whether, Chris, yourself, you see that.
I'm sorry, Andrew, but I really have to disagree with you on some of this stuff.
But what specifically?
Specifically, I think we're kidding ourselves if we are pretending that there is no bias against Islam or the Muslim community out there. I think we're completely kidding ourselves, and it's partially driven through the upheavals globally, and it's also partially driven because of a lack of understanding.
Just let me respond to that specifically.
Let me finish, please. Because I have noticed over the last 30, 40 years, I've noticed that we are regressing in our debate to a degree where religion now plays an absurdly prominent role in our national debate, where it used to be almost a trivial sideline. Suddenly everybody's talking about religion military operation, on-water operations, glorifying wars, we have this regression, and we seem to have an increased acceptance of sheer bigotry and blatant bigotry. And this is precisely what our Attorney General was trying to address in his own clumsy way. You have the right to be a bigot.
In what ways do you see that extending to the discussion about immigration and boat arrivals? Though?
Well,
that's
because
particularly what we're trying to get
we
at
are
here.
reflecting this in our legislation. The Migration Act allows the very people who decide whether or not to grant a visa to also incarcerate someone. We don't have the separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, etc. We have all this under the one umbrella of the Immigration Department, and the only conflict we seem to be able to resolve is through the courts. We only seem to find an avenue for understanding through the courts these days, because the polls are showing, and as your statistics show, the biases are too large for the politicians to solve, or the media.
Okay, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, please. Okay, so see, what I'm trying to do is to get beyond generalisations such as bias. There is bias.
Yes.
There is bias. I'm not for a second wanting to minimise that. But what I'm trying to do is to understand that there's segments of the community and to understand the segments of the community. And what I'm saying to you is, even though there's a very significant segment of the community which is biased, and on my calculations it's probably 10% hardcore and another 30% tending in that direction.
Very wishy-washy.
We can actually sort of say that there's actually very strong counter views as well, and that's what makes up our society. That's the first point I made. The second point to make is that if it was prejudice and bigotry, they would actually run the humanitarian program in such a way that they wouldn't allow into this country Africans, they wouldn't allow Muslims. They're not doing that. But let me just finish, all right? Yeah. If you actually look at the humanitarian program, per capita is about one of the largest in the world, much larger than the United States. You look at the Women at Risk program and so on, compare us with a number of countries, and we do really well. Now, again, and maybe this won't be appropriate, but if we think about your sister, yeah, and we say it's all driven by prejudice and bigotry, they would have said, this is a white girl, why on earth are you locking her up? You see?
Well,
but they didn't do that.
Because once you get... See, this is what I'm trying to say in my very clumsy way, because I'm much better writer than I'm a speaker. What we have is this, overall, we have this fantastic immigration program. Now, 95% of the immigration program is well-meaning, it's well-run, etc. And then we have this little offshoot that deals with boat arrivals, which suddenly turns into which one's Dr. Jekyll and which one's Mr. Hyde. I can never remember. Which one's the nasty one? Is it
Hyde.
Mr. Hyde? Okay. Well, Mr. Hyde is the way we treat people who are now in offshore detention. And generally we have a fantastic, I mean, your resettlement group, they do fantastic work, and the churches, etc. So why are we falling down on this one little segment?
Because it's not little. It's not little. That's the point.
Well, it's not little financially, but it's little
because it runs counter to the thing about numbers. That's the central point that I think Andrew made.
Just to make this one point, when you got to 25,000 arrivals, that actually stopped being little in the big ways.
But still, I mean, in comparison to Europe, you've got...
Well, Europe is a continent. People understand this.
400 million people.
And
Australia is one
unique.
country.
All right, I think before we sort of descend too much into a discussion on numbers, we try and take another question.
Can I just say...
We'll just take this question first, Chris, and then we'll go back.
I don't really have a question, but it's more of a statement. I understand that we should understand the complexities of this issue and how perceptions of refugees and asylum seekers are made, but I don't think we should ignore the problem that the media, ignorance, and politicians and political views have. You talk about value systems, but our value systems are shaped through the media. We don't live in a social vacuum. And in Australia, the mass media plays a large role in how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and also how we see the other. That's with Arab other, the Asian other during Parramatta in 1980s. But we have to understand that the media plays a huge role, and with the media, the politics and government, there's a real interrelation between them, and also influence of the power of the government through that. Also, we don't only hear political views on the issue, but refugees and asylum seekers are silenced. And how do I know? And like an example is because photographers and journalists aren't able to go to Manus Island in detention centres and in Nauru. There's been specific guidelines that photographers shouldn't take photos of asylum seekers and refugees that humanize them. And also, when you talk about education and that we shouldn't educate people about change people's perceptions. We shouldn't lock them up. I don't think education should be about locking them up. I think there's other ways of educating people, and that's also about raising consciousness, and it's about community action and community awareness. Because that's what we're losing. We only have one perception. We need more truths. There's not one absolute truth, but there's many truths, and one truth is greater than the other. That's what I believe.
Okay. Do you mind if I sort of try and wrap that into a little question, if that's possible? I mean, it seemed to be what that lady was saying was that your research kind of alludes to a sort of political vacuum in a way. I mean, I think that was the sort of expression that she was using. That if you sort of condense these things in statistics, where there's not much shift in public opinion on some of the issues that we're talking about, that somehow equates to a vacuum of opinion. I mean, is that your understanding of it, or?
I'm not sure if I 100% understand, but if I can just make the point, I think it's really important to do everything possible you can educate. It's really important to challenge the media. But it's also very important to try to understand how the whole thing's operating. Is the Murdoch press running a particular line? Of course it is. Are they selecting photographs, to make the issue look as bad as possible? Of course they are. That's my understanding anyway. Just like other segments of the media, I think it was a really important point you made at the beginning of the media is becoming increasingly segmented, and increasingly the media talks to its demographic, and that's a real big issue, isn't it? But as for educating, doing everything that you can possibly can to humanise and to explain the multiple meanings, that's wonderful. I'm 110% in favour of that. But at the same time, I'm saying try to understand the complexities of what happens. If a shock jock in Sydney is able to rouse people up and cause a riot, yes, that shows the power of the media. But that's an exceptional case. That's not necessarily how a media changes people to become X, Y, and Z.
I also ask what complexities are you talking about? Because you always say there are complexities, but what kind of complexities are we talking about, are we dealing with, if not the media at large, or if not politics at large?
No, well, if you think that those efforts are going to produce a situation where you're going to change the whole outlook on this situation, I don't think that's possible, and I don't think that will occur. On the other hand, there's advocacy and speaking up for the horrendous things that are being done in my name, in your name, in our name. Speaking up, is that important? Of course it's vitally important, because it's part of a dialogue, yes? And if one part of the dialogue drops out, then the whole thing can become much worse. So it's very important to do that. But what I'm saying is I've been trying to understand, are there avenues where you're going to bring about significant change in Australia 5 years, 10 years and 15 years? And my view is that it's not. And the other view is that it actually is a big issue for Australia. It's not just a minor issue. When there were 500 people arriving, when there was 1,000 people arriving, it was a minor issue. In 2012, 13 it stopped being a minor issue.
Chris, can I just ask you and Mark, I mean, your sort of discussion of the avenues to bring about change seemed to focus mainly on the humanitarian resettlement programme, if that was my understanding. I mean, I wonder whether either of you two have any ideas on where you see change coming from, or whether it's just contained to that one particular policy portfolio.
That's always a million-dollar question, isn't it? We all can criticise, but how would we develop a balanced approach which on the one hand allows us to be humane to people wanting to come in, but on the other hand not be overrun, because of course if you're too lenient then you have the prospect of letting of having no control left, and you can't let in to a parched continent too many people. It's just geographically absurd. But can I just backtrack a tiny bit? You were saying that politics and the media and the drive to the bottom don't have much influence on this debate, and I'd like to just disagree with some of those points, because I think the media do have an important role, not only in explaining and exploring the issues and trying to be fair and balanced, the best of them, but also the ones that are deliberately distorting and omitting information that the public wouldn't be so mean to refugees if they knew how awful the treatment was on Manus or Nauru, for example. And then you say that politicians aren't driving it. However, it's the politicians who are using this military jargon and who aren't allowing any sort of information to get through. And your outlet, The Guardian, only yesterday published some of the expenditure figures, between 3 and 4 billion a year in offshore detention. Now, if people if people could get their heads around this, 3 or 4 billion, how many schools, hospitals, roads, etc., I don't think they'd mind too many refugees in the community. But the media isn't doing it. The Guardian's doing it, yes, but the Guardian is preaching to the converted. Just like the telly's preaching to the converted, just like Alan Jones is preaching to the converted, till they all die.
So, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask Mark the same question about solutions, really. I'm not just talking about.
I should have said in the middle.
I'm not just talking about policy here. I'm talking about attitudes in communities, and I wonder whether there's anything that you observed in your time in Blacktown or any other time in your career where you've really seen attitudes change and really what it was that was driving that.
Yeah, I disagree in part that I believe you can change public perception, and maybe it is value driven. But I saw, and just prior to starting at Blacktown, I went and met at STARTS, the New South Wales Torture and Trauma area, and there was a lot of animosity between the local African community and the local police, and there was a lot of negative feelings amongst the broader community. And by those simple symbols of engagement, of a better understanding, being a vehicle to help them promote and highlight some of the positive aspects of the community, I think we did change opinion. It was interesting, there was a show being filmed out there many years ago called The Secret Millionaire, and the host, nobody knew who it was, and I knew who he was, and we took him around some children, and he saw a young boy playing guitar out at West Point, sitting there strumming his guitar, and he sat him up beside him, and he thought, oh, this will be a hard luck story, I'll get something here, a young boy in Blacktown. And in short, he said he's waiting to pick his brother up, he's about to finish work, and he said, what are you doing? He said, I've just finished uni. He said, what are you doing? He said, I'm doing a degree in medical science. And he got up and he walked away, and he said, these kids don't need my help. So it was just that whole perception that low socioeconomic area, highly populated, high unemployment, and the perception is there, but by actually investing a lot of energy and a lot of time into try to promote the positive aspects, I think we did change some opinions. And I think this debate has to happen. I think it's very important, but there's the top-down and there's the bottom-up influences. And having been on the management committee for SydWest Multicultural for 5 years and as the vice chair when I left Blacktown, the work that you people do are very significant in shaping that opinion. And you can continue to drive that change from the bottom up. And I think that's really significant. I think sometimes we forget that we have high-level debates, but the real change can sometimes come from within and from below. So if we continue to invest our time and our energy, and I wonder what the demographics of the community will look like in the future. Blacktown is the highest. I think Fairfield is the next most diverse community. But that will be indicative of communities going forward. And you mentioned about Canada being one that's also accepting of immigration. The Canadians came out to Blacktown to have a look at what we were doing. And you talk about media, we got minimal media on that, which was a fantastic story. And they came all the way out here to see what we were doing in relation to immigration and how we were helping to integrate those community members. So I think there's a lot of good stories out there. Getting traction is difficult. And I could point out that the good story on the Sydney Morning Herald they wrote isn't up on the board either, Christine. But and this is the thing, it's about promoting the good stories sometimes.
Just to clarify, I don't want to say that at the micro level, you can't, an individual such as you and others can make a tremendous difference, or your organisation can make a tremendous difference. Of course it can. But see, my conversation is about what happens at the macro level, when all those exceptional individuals tend to get washed out on that. And the other thing is it's about the scale of the problem. And we're talking of the scale of the problem where the number of people wanting to resettle in Australia is numbered in the millions. But I've seen it, and I'm sure you've all seen it, an exceptional individual changes an environment. No question.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, I think. So if anybody has a last one.
I've just got one. First of all, my comment about the mainstream media. I think that they are very detrimental to what's going on and their opinions that they promote. But my main thing was about young people and ethics in schools. I think to start with the very young and having politicians within, I guess supporting ethics in schools and starting at a very grassroots level with little children trying to change prejudices and opinions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's been an interesting sort of twist from my point of view. Just reading about it in the papers, there's an interesting movement going on in Catholic schools at the moment, where lots of young school kids are sort of galvanising around the issue. And I wonder, as we're talking about here, I'm talking about grassroots. Is that something that you've noticed over the past few months, maybe a few years, as these attitudes are hardening, that it's changing on the grassroots with younger people?
Absolutely. One of the focus, so in Blacktown, we had 50% of the population under the age of 30 and 30% under the age of 17. So the biggest impact that we had and the most success we had was engaging with the younger community and getting them to better understand each other and appreciate each other. And that was through song, dance, things that they enjoyed. As I said to our PCYC, our Police Boys Club, that boxing and rope climbing is gone. A lot of the new generation now like to be involved in singing and dancing and food. If they can explore cultural differences in their food. So absolutely I agree that the way forward is to as early as possible to engage with that youth and get them to appreciate. They don't see culture, they don't see colour, they don't see race, they just see a person. And the more we focus on that, I think the better we'll be in the future.
Professor Marcus, just on the statistical side of things, I mean, is there any disparity between ages when you're talking about attitudes of refugees and asylum seekers?
So that was why I put that and analysed those 30 variables. And that's a macro level. It's not a micro level analysis. And at the macro level, like you would think that it's not just starting today. There's been attempts through the education system to bring about fundamental change. Then we look at 18 to 24-year-olds, university educated. Can you find within them, at the macro level, a different attitude? And the answer was basically no. So, on the other hand, always good to end on a positive note, yeah? Like, where was Australia in 1980? I know where it was in 1980. I grew up in an earlier time, but where was it in 1980? This was a society which was still in the last days of its racially discriminatory immigration policies. And then, like, within 10 or 15 years, like areas that I studied in Melbourne, like Springvale, and you've got the equivalents here, you'd go down one street and you'd find like 20 different nationalities living side by side. Which other country, has succeeded in pulling that one off? Like you look at Russia and Ukraine today, how long have they been at it? How many noughts do we want to add on the years? So this Australian society has achieved amazing things. Which is not to say that it's done a fantastic job in this space. And as we've discussed, there's big issues.
Segmentation. I was talking about, the broader humanitarian, then the voter rights.
Yep.
Voter rights should really be under the
I think
General's
we've actually just run out of time, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to leave it there. Unless, is there one last question? Am I going to be able to get away with that? Yeah? Any last question? Yeah, over here.
Mine's actually a fairly specific question. Professor Marcus, you talked about the challenge for those working in the educational awareness raising space is that people interpret data through their values. I'm just wondering whether your research looked specifically at the values formation stuff at all. I mean, we say that people's opinions are shaped by their values, but is that an assumption? Or do we have some idea of where that values formation comes from? Because it seems to me that's what the childhood thing is about. That's where the work needs to happen.
Yep.
That's a great question.
Yep. It's a great question. I'm working at the descriptive level, but your question goes to social psychology and individual psychology. And actually, we're working with some psychologists at the ANU to actually look at this data and see if they can see different things in it. But that's again like a whole different level of issues. Yeah.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much indeed, and say thank you very much to our panellists as well.
I just would like to reiterate the words of thanks to all our speakers tonight, and also I would like to thank you, the audience, for coming along tonight, and we hope to see you back for our next speaker series event on the theme of refugee youth. That will be on the 11th of November here at SSI. So please make sure you have joined our mailing list or our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter and receive updates on that. Thank you very much.